Witcomb, who cannot be with us today, but she has honored us with contributing a talk that will be played after this discussion. For those of you who do not know Andrea Witcomb, she's Associate Professor at the Faculty of Arts at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. She has taught at the Research Institute for Cultural Heritage at Curtin University in Perth. She's the author of Reimagining the Museum and the co-author of From the Barracks to the Bar, the National Trust in Western Australia with Kate Gregory. And she has edited a lot of books, including South Pacific Museums and Experiences in Culture, with Chris Healy and with Kylie Message, Museum Theory, which is the volume 1 of International Handbooks of Museum Studies, co-edited by Sharon McDonald and Helen Rees. As I said, Andrea cannot be with us today, but she was given us the privilege of watching a recorded talk. She talks about some artistic projects she has curated in her practice. Thank you all very much for joining us in this conversation, especially our speakers today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we did, and you've taken a lot from this conversation. And I hope to see you online, or even better, in person at some point in the future. Thank you all very much.
Hello, I'm Andrea Witcomb, and I'm so pleased to be here today talking with you. And I'm so sorry that I can't either be there in person or that you are listening to a recording rather than a live conversation. We've just come out of lockdown in Melbourne. And so my family and I, after 7 months of being at home without being able to go out beyond 5 kilometres from the front door, we're doing a very Australian thing and going bushwalking for 5 days. So I'm really sorry. But if after what I have to share with you today, you have any questions at all, please do feel free to email me. Contact details on my PowerPoint or via Facebook, and I'm more than willing to share what little I know with you. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see me up in the corner and my presentation. So just let's hang on a minute. Here we are. Yes, this will work. So Lena, who kindly invited me to talk with you today, asked me to think and talk to you about how we represent communities here in Australia. So this is something that I've been researching for a while, and which I myself have been involved with as a curator in the past. But now I teach, I work in the university, so I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've learned as I've observed how museums in Australia represent communities. Of course, we are a, no, why isn't this working? We are what we call a settler society. We came here as part of the British Empire in the late 18th century, and of course colonized what was an indigenous country. And ever since, we have been a nation based on migration. So all that I have to say needs to be understood in that context. But I want to suggest, I guess, that even though Greece and Australia have very different historical experiences, there might be more in common than we might at first think. So I think we may as well start with trying to answer this question: what is a community? And I think that the kind of conventional standard answer to that question is that a community is a group of people who feel bounded to one another because they share enough in common to have a connection to each other. And the conventional idea is that this is so because they share a language, or they live in the same nation state, or have the same ethnicity, or they practice the same religion within that nation state, or they share the same cultural practices. So this, no doubt, is of no surprise to you. It's how we all tend to think of answering that question, what is a community, I think. But I want to suggest that in reality, things are not quite so simple. And this is because the closer you look, the more apparent it is that the notion of community is made rather than given. I think that homogeneous communities are actually very hard to find. The more we learn about our past, the more we learn that we have a long history of human movement across the globe. And this is an image from one of the first versions of the Immigration Museum here in Melbourne. And as you can see, there's an image of a boat full of migrants arriving in Melbourne after World War II with all their worldly belongings. And of course, you in Greece are probably very well aware that Melbourne in the 1950s, or Melbournia as you called it, was in fact the second largest city of Greek-speaking peoples in the world. It was actually had more Greek-speaking people here in Melbourne at that point than Thessaloniki. So that's how many Greeks came to Australia at that time. And the point I really want to make here is that those long histories of human movement, of mobility across the globe, those histories are embedded in our languages, in our material culture, in our religious practices, and in our culture, whether it's here or anywhere else in the world. And if we reflect on this, what we find is that communities develop over time through practices. What we do binds us together. And if that is so, communities can also change over time. What is the case at any one point in time is not necessarily the case forever. And going on from that, one might say that therefore there is no reason to not open ourselves up to understanding these histories and their legacies in the present through the way we represent communities in museums. And I think that this is especially important to do in contexts that are experiencing change in the nature of their communities. I think that museums can help people understand and process changing ideas of who can belong in their community, in their place. Learning to accept these histories and their current manifestations is not easy, though. I fully recognize that. So what I'm asking museums to do, or what I am arguing museums can do, is certainly not an easy request. As you can see here, and there's no doubt you've seen in Greece as well, these days, the mobility of people is all too evident, and the stresses on homogeneous notions of community is very evident all over the world. Xenophobia is well and truly alive in our current world. But so is the opposite. So is the idea that it is possible to welcome strangers amongst us, that it is possible to live with diversity. And I want to have a look at how we might do that, or how we might progress that idea in museums. So you might think that in Australia, given that we are what we call a migrant settler state, as I sort of explained at the beginning, that Australians would understand this very well. But even here, it can be too easy to distance ourselves from the history of colonisation, to assume that multiculturalism is a post-Second World War phenomenon, and that Australians are essentially an outpost of Britain. But that story is getting more and more difficult to maintain. Museums have had an important role in helping people recognise that Australia is not as homogeneous as we sometimes think, and that our history is not separate from that of the rest of the world. And as you can see here too in Australia, we have the very same tension that we see in Europe today. So on the left, we have a cartoon of an elderly lady saying, "I know it's extremely un-Australian of me, but I'd like to welcome you to our shores." And of course, who's coming to our shores is a boat of refugees. And it's in reference to a very significant crisis in Australia in 2001, when the Scandinavian ship, Danish, if I recall properly, the Tampa, a commercial ship, gathered hundreds of refugees whose boat was sinking, and brought them to Australia, as Australia was the nearest country according to international law. And to our shame, we refused to take them in. And then, of course, on the right-hand side is a badge from a sort of, I suppose, a xenophobic attitude, saying that we don't want refugees here, that Australia is full. So what we call, what many would regard as racist, and I guess those who don't, do not. And what is interesting is you can see that museums are collecting evidence of both of those positions. So the Australia is full badges in Museums Victoria here in Melbourne, and a cartoon is part of a collection of cartoons that the National Museum of Australia collects every year, representing a whole range of political views. This kind of tension between whether or not Australia is a homogeneous nation and just whether or not migrants are part of our community is, and the place of museums in helping people understand the answers to those questions is, I think, encapsulated in this letter, which I found in the archive in the Migration Museum in Adelaide. The Migration Museum in Adelaide is the first migration museum in the world. And a lady writing to the curators there, wanting to offer some items from her family who were English speaking. She was a descendant of English migrants in the 19th century. And she was a little bit confused, having visited the museum, both about who the museum was for, who was the intended audience, and who the museum represented. So let's have a look. She says, "I would also like to ask two related things, which have puzzled me since a brief visit to the museum some years ago. One is to ask if you want donations of crafts and small items used in households in South Australia during the last century. these are from the wave of first settlers, that is Anglo-Celtic, so English. The related question is whether the museum is mainly about the subsequent waves of settlers, and I think she has in mind post-war migrants, or is the history of the early mainly Anglo-Celtic people given appropriate space? Perhaps when I was there, I missed some rooms where their history is featured, but ever since my visit, I have thought of the museum as being about the migration to South Australia of the various ethnic minorities. I am correct in thinking this, she asked. It's interesting that she was confused because this museum was trying to do a number of things. It was trying to say everyone who is not Indigenous in Australia is a migrant, including English people. That migrating to Australia was part of colonisation. And that from the very first boatload of migrants to South Australia, in this case, to Adelaide, there were a number of ethnicities, not only English people. So as you can see in this image, there is reference to the racism experienced by Chinese migrants to Australia. There's evidence that Muslim people migrated to Australia with a Bible printed in Arabic that belonged to someone from Lebanon. There were Italians, and this is just one image, but there were also Germans and Greeks and Yugoslavs, people from Russia, Jewish people. There were many, many ethnicities and multiple religions in Australia from the very beginning. So I have 4 contentions or 4 issues, 4 propositions that I want to put to you. The first one, which I'm calling the politics of representation, is to suggest that if museums are about the representation of identity, then who is included in that representation matters. And this is because representation is a statement about whether any one group is included or not in the community of the nation. And the notion here is that it is important to include everyone, to be pluralist in our representations rather than singular. So here again at the Migration Museum in Adelaide, you can see here on the left a representation of the cultural traditions of many migrants to South Australia from all over the world. And just beside me on your screen, there is a photograph of a display looking at world issues from the 1970s to the early 2000s that of course led to many refugees, starting with the Vietnam War and obviously going through all the problems in the Middle East, and then straight below it a representation of what was going on in Australia at the same time and our attitudes towards the people who were fleeing these wars and crises all over the world. If we say that representing all the many groups of people that live in our communities, in our places, then we also have to think about how we do this. It's not only, the issue is not only to try to include as many people as possible, it's also to think about how we do that. Because it is possible to actually include other people, but to do so in ways that actually exclude them from the very community that we're trying to say they are part of. And we need to understand that. And one of the things I want to say is that how we write our labels is really important. So one of my points today is to talk about the effect or the impact of writing in the third person, and I'm talking about verbs, as opposed to writing in the first person. So on my left, there's a label in a museum in Albury, which is very close to one of the major migration camps for post-war migrants, post-Second World War migrants to Australia. So many Greek migrants to Australia at that time would have gone to Bonegilla. But if we look at this label, it's written in the third person plural. People remember the smells of eucalyptus, the detergent used in the toilets and latrines, the unfamiliar smell of nearby bushfires, mutton cooking, and the all-pervasive smell of cigarettes. They remember the sounds of the squeaky iron beds, the hiss of illegal kerosene primuses, an occasional accordion, the lullabies sung in different languages, blowflies, magpies caroling, crows cawing, these are birds, and loudspeakers blaring instructions. And it goes on. It's all they, and it's all in the past, and it's about memory. But the people themselves are not really present. There are no names. They don't speak for themselves. This is the authority of the museum, the third person curator, writing about them. Not writing about us, but writing about them. A kind of related issue is the label on the right, where you have, again, a number of post-war migrants arriving, and it deals with, the theme is, why did people leave? Why did people want to come to Australia? But I want to point to the sort of lead heading, which is a quote. So this is a little better in my way of looking at things, in that it does actually quote someone. My husband had been told that we would be able to make it big. That is why we came to Australia. But the quote is not from a named person. It just says Latvian displaced person around 1951. So again, it makes it representative. They're included, but they're not seen as full subjects. If they were, they would have a name. This makes it anonymous, and that matters, because if they're anonymous, they're not a historical agent. They don't have the same subjectivity that you and I have. Now, if we're really serious about inclusion, then I think we need to think very carefully about these three things. We need to use first-person narratives, i.e., people speaking in the first person. I did this. we need to think about how we use second person plural, we, rather than they, as in that first label that I showed you. And we also need to think about the relationship between the past and the present. And you can see in this presentation here at the Migration Museum in Melbourne this time. So this is a very, one of the tropes of multiculturalism in Australia is around food. But you can see here that people are talking in first person. So the first one on the left, I'll tell you this one thing about Italian food that Asian people don't understand, and that's risotto. My mum reckons risotto is Italian for who stuffed up the rice. And look, there's an author, Hung Lee, Melbourne, 2004. The other interesting thing that's happening here is complexity. So this is someone from an Asian background commenting on risotto, an Italian food. So straight away we're playing with the idea that one cultural tradition can only belong to the ethnicity that produced that cultural tradition. So in that case, risotto is Italian, but it can't be Australian. So straight away here, the fact that someone from an Asian Australian background is commenting in a sort of funny way about risotto breaks those distinctions down. The next one says, I am from Africa and been wondering since I arrived in Australia where to get goat meat. I was surprised there are goat farms where people can buy goat. So assumptions made about each other and what we might do and not do, have and not have. Those two are being broken down. And here's one for the Anglo-Celtics. My grandmother, Dolly May Campbell, was born in Queensland of Scottish descent. I used to love staying with her overnight so we could have porridge for breakfast. I'll never forget how heavenly that porridge smelled. One of the issues in Australia is the idea that the only people with culture are the migrants, not Australians, by which we mean Anglo-Celtic or those from the British Isles. So here, those of Scottish descent are in exactly the same position as those from Italy or those from Africa. We're all migrants. And the other interesting thing here is that this isn't only about the past, it's about the past in the present, how that past lives in us through memories and through practices and through multicultural cross-sharing of cultural traditions. At the same museum, at the Migration Museum in Melbourne, here in the same exhibition called Identity, we can see the use of first-person narratives. And again, they're all the authors from whom the quotes are taken and named. But there's also curatorial commentary on that. So for example, and here's an interesting use of we, second person plural, what we eat. The we there is every one of us. The first quote is from someone who by their name would seem to come from Italian background. Lunch was different, a bit sniffier, meaning a bit smellier. a bit of salami and odd bits and pieces inside the sangers. Sangers is colloquial Australian for sausages. We were just a little bit different. And then there's the curator. The food we eat does more than nourish us. It reveals what we like, believe in, and where we've come from. Growing up, our school lunchbox can be a source of envy or shame. Later, we may take pride in the food traditions of our families. We now have more cuisines, ingredients, cooking shows, and recipe books than ever before. Today, it seems most of us know the differences between prosciutto and pancetta, sushi and sashimi. So there you have a very interesting use of we, where the general population, which includes everyone, can reflect on how we have become, I suppose, in some ways, hybrid. We have taken on all of these different cultural practices, all of these different traditions, and in a way, made them our own. In other words, the history of mobilities of human movement has come to make Australia what Australia is today. And we are not homogeneous, and nor would we want to be, because we are the richer for having all of these traditions on our land. The other thing that can happen is that we can use quotations, oral histories, to communicate narratives. So here, for example, at Bonegilla, that same migration camp that I referred to earlier, you have people talking about bringing their cultural traditions with them. My fourth contention is that we need to think about what getting to that point involves. What is it that we need to do as curators to be able to use first-person narratives, to be able to use we in interesting ways? I think it means that we need to collect multiple sides of any one story. We need to engage with the practice of oral histories. We need to collaborate with all the communities that live in our place. We need to be willing to engage with complexity, and we need to be willing to leave conclusions open-ended. That we want freedom is what a Hazari refugee said in an exhibition called "They Cannot Take the Sky" at the Melbourne Migration Museum. So, collecting. At the National Museum of Australia, the very first object that they collected was a Vietnamese refugee boat. So it was collected in the very first year of this museum's existence in 1985. And you see there an image of it arriving in Darwin and an image of it in dry dock in Darwin Port. And then it travelled all the way to Canberra, our capital, to be part of the National Museum. We can collect both sides of the story, and we can display both sides of the story. So here at the Migration Museum in Melbourne, we have the idea that Australia is full, that we should not be taking any more migrants and certainly not any more refugees. And then there's the idea that racism is un-Australian and that we should be taking refugees and migrants. So in other words, museums don't have to solve the controversy, they can present controversy and multiple points of view. And that is another way of representing a community at any given point of time. The fact that we have differences of opinion should not be no reason for not displaying those differences of opinion. In that exhibition that I told you about, They Cannot Take the Sky, that was at the Migration Museum in Melbourne, and it was an exhibition put together by a group of people outside the museum, a refugee advocacy group working with refugees. So they worked with them, did video testimonies, and the exhibition used these video testimonies to try to communicate with the Australian general public as to why refugees were wanting to come to Australia, what their experiences were in government-run detention centres, a very controversial policy of our government until very recently. And above all, I think the exhibition was an opportunity for Australians to bear witness to what our own government was doing. And this is what one of those testifiers rather, said. This is Behrooz Boochani, who became a very high-profile refugee living on Nauru, one of the government detention centres in Papua New Guinea, who has since migrated to New Zealand. But in, as you can see, a very evocative, very strong testimony, says to Australians that the whole of Australia made this trouble. And he goes on to say, and I think the history will make a judgment about Australia in the future. And the next generation in Australia, one day, they will think about Manus and Nauru and they will blame them. But it's not enough at that time. So he's inviting us to think about what it is that we were allowing our government to do. And in fact, a lot of the advocacy around refugee policies and politics in Australia revolved around the words of Behrooz Boochani. He wrote a book that was very influential. And this is what one of the visitors to that exhibition said. I feel moved in a way I cannot describe. It overwhelms me that there are still people living like this. It is so unjust and inhumane. More people should know about this. I wasn't expecting to see this today, but for some reason I have. And it has changed my stance from which I have been doing and meaning life. What I find difficult no longer feels hard. One of the exhibitions at the Migration Museum in Melbourne finishes with this statement. Where to from here? I am a Sudanese in origin, an Ethiopian by birth, a Kenyan by naturalization, and I am becoming Australian. I am simply like any other young person trying to establish my own understanding of the meaning of life and my surroundings. Through the meaning of we, sometimes we can define the I. I hope that helps to explain why I've been focusing on the way we use language, on whether we say we, whether we allow for any multiplicity of I's to speak with their name, or whether we don't. And again, this is what the museum itself has to say. We are the sum of many parts. Some we know well, others we are yet to uncover. Sharing our stories can change us. Laughing with one another reveals what we have in common. We can begin to recognize our prejudices and work together to overcome them. I think if this is true about Australia, it probably is true about any place on earth. And I just wanted to leave you with some images from a trip I did to Lesbos with one of my very best friends and colleagues, Alexandra Bunia, who I'm sure you know. So this was Lesbos in 2017. So just after your own recent refugee crisis. And these are just some images of what struck me as an Australian in your country, thinking about some of these issues. And I think here you'll be able to see a statue commemorating the refugees of the 1922 Exodus, a mosque in a rather parlous, ruined state, the basilica in a very good state, the museum with ancient Greek civilization. Down center, the bottom, a display done by students at the university about your own boat arrivals from Turkey on Lesbos. And two images from a museum in a little scala just south of the capital, where you can see the map from which the Ottoman Greeks came in that 1922 Exodus, and the attempt by the descendants of those refugees, not only in developing a community museum to their memory, but their own attempt to recognize that there were others who also suffered. And so that is a shawl from the Turkish refugees who had to leave their homes in Lesbos and return to Greece as part of the political settlement. So in other words, mobilities create opportunities, create pain, create cultures, create nations. And the more we can do to recognize the complexity of the communities we live in, perhaps the more peaceful the world might become. I'll leave it there. I hope that you find something of value in this presentation. And as I said, I am more than willing to engage in conversation, either through email or Facebook. And I'm just so sorry that I can't be there at the time that you're meeting, because I'll be, it's the last day of the bushwalk and I'll actually be bushwalking out. I miss you by about 10 hours and I'm just so sorry about that. Okay, hope you've had a really good day and lots of enriching conversations.